I arrived at my father's second wedding to find a name tag reading Housekeeper pinned to my chest by venue staff. His stepmother, Diana, smirked. "You're just staff here. No chair reserved. No plate set. No place at family table." My brother Jake chuckled. "Food is for family." I stood tall, slid off my grandfather's family ring, placed it on the gift table, and declared, "Then, I'm no longer your family." Their confident smiles vanished instantly, but this public humiliation was only the beginning of my calculated revenge. 6 months before that devastating wedding day, my father Robert had called me with excitement in his voice. He was getting remarried. At 28, I thought I'd processed my mother's death enough to be genuinely happy for him. Mom had been gone for 3 years, and the loneliness was eating him alive. "Her name's Diana," he said, over coffee at our usual diner. "She's wonderful, Marlon. Smart, successful, and she really gets me." Diana was a widow herself, a real estate agent with expensive tastes and a portfolio that included some of the nicest homes in our Connecticut suburb. When I first met her, she seemed polite enough, though there was something cold behind her smile that made me uncomfortable. But Dad was happier than I'd seen him since Mom's funeral, so I pushed my doubts aside. I should have trusted my instincts. The months leading up to their wedding became a blur of me trying to help, while slowly being pushed to the margins. I was struggling financially as a freelance graphic designer, still paying off the crushing debt from Mom's medical bills. I'd given up my college fund to help with her treatment costs, while Jake finished law school debt-free. Dad had promised things would get better once he recovered from the financial devastation, but that recovery never seemed to come. When Diana entered the picture, suddenly, Dad had money again. Expensive dinners, weekend trips, a lavish engagement ring that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. I tried not to be bitter, but it stung watching him spend freely on his new life while I was still drowning in the bills from trying to save Mom. "I want to help with the wedding," I told him one afternoon while we worked in his garage. "I can design your invitations for free, maybe help with some of the planning." Dad's face lit up. "That would mean a lot, son. Diana's handling most of it, but she'd love your input." Except Diana didn't love my input. Every suggestion I made was politely dismissed. Every design I created was not quite right, but she was happy to accept my free labor, having me stuff envelopes and handle the grunt work while she made all the real decisions. "You're so generous with your time," she said one evening, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Most people your age are so selfish." The backhanded compliments were constant. My little freelance business, my modest apartment, my simple lifestyle choices. She had a gift for making kindness sound like pity. 3 weeks before the wedding, Dad came to me with an unusual request. "I'm a bit short on the venue deposit," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Diana's tied up some money in a new property deal. Could you help us out? Just $3,000. He'll pay you back right after the honeymoon." $3,000 was nearly everything I had saved, but it was Dad. I liquidated my emergency fund and handed him the check, trusting that family meant something. 2 weeks before the wedding, I gave up my apartment. The lease was ending anyway, and moving back home temporarily would save money I desperately needed. Dad seemed happy to have me around, but Diana made it clear the arrangement was temporary. "It'll be nice having help around the house," she said, watching me carry boxes to the garage, "until you get back on your feet." The morning of the wedding, I dressed in my best suit, the navy one Mom had helped me pick out for job interviews years ago. I arrived early to help with setup, expecting to be seated with family during the ceremony. Instead, a venue coordinator approached me with a name tag. "You're the housekeeper, right?" she said, holding out the adhesive label. "Mrs. Richardson requested you wear this so the caterers know who you are." I stared at the tag. "There's been a mistake. I'm the groom's son." "Oh." She looked confused. glancing at her clipboard. But Mrs. Richardson specifically said, Diana appeared like she'd been waiting in the wings. Is there a problem here, Marlon? They think I'm the housekeeper, I said, holding up the name tag. Diana's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Well, there seems to be some confusion about the seating arrangements. Why don't you help in the kitchen for now, and we'll sort this out later? Sort what out? I'm family. Of course you are, sweetie. Her voice was sugar-sweet venom. But you understand, space is limited, and we've had some last-minute changes. That's when I noticed there was no place card with my name at any table. The family table had settings for Dad, Diana, Jake, Diana's sister, and several people I didn't recognize. But not me. Jake appeared beside Diana, straightening his tie. He looked uncomfortable, but said nothing when Diana handed me the name tag again. Just for today, she said, to avoid confusion. I looked at my brother, waiting for him to speak up, to defend me, to acknowledge how insane this was. Instead, he shrugged. Come on, Marlon. Don't make a scene. It's just a name tag. The ceremony was beautiful. I watched from the back, standing against the wall like hired help while my father married a woman who was systematically erasing me from his life. During the reception, I tried to approach the family table, but Diana intercepted me every time. The caterers need direction. She'd say, steering me toward the kitchen. Could you help them with the wine service? By the time dinner was served, I was exhausted and humiliated. I stood in the corner, watching my family eat while I wore a name tag that labeled me as an employee. Other guests kept asking me for refills and directions to the bathroom. That's when Diana delivered the final blow. You're just staff here, she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. She was smiling, but her eyes were cold as winter. No chair, no plate, no place. Jake laughed, actually laughed, as he cut his steak. Food is for family, he said, not even looking at me. Something broke inside me. The last 3 years of sacrifice, of putting my family first while drowning in debt, of swallowing my pride and accepting scraps of affection, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. I walked to the gift table, where wedding presents sat wrapped in expensive paper. Slowly, deliberately, I slid my grandfather's ring off my finger. It was the only thing of value I owned, a simple gold band that had been passed down through 3 generations. I placed it carefully among the gifts. Then, I'm no longer your family, I said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. The confident smiles vanished from Diana's and Jake's faces. Dad looked up from his conversation, confused by the sudden silence. Other guests turned to stare. Diana recovered first, her mask slipping back into place. Marlon, you're being dramatic. Am I? I looked around the room, at all these people celebrating a marriage built on lies and manipulation. Enjoy your new family, Dad. I hope they're worth it. I walked out of that reception hall with nothing but the clothes on my back and a burning determination to discover the truth about the woman who had just stolen my father and turned my brother against me. The humiliation was complete. But as I drove away from the venue, I realized something important. For the first time in 3 years, I felt completely free. I returned to Dad's house the next evening to collect my belongings, expecting the place to be empty since he and Diana were supposed to be on their honeymoon. Instead, I found lights on in the study and heard voices arguing inside. Told you he wouldn't make a scene, Diana was saying. Now he's going to be a problem, Hez my son, Dad replied, but his voice sounded weak, uncertain. Has a leech who's been draining you dry for years. The medical bills, the handouts, the constant guilt trips about his mother. When are you going to put your new family first? I crept closer to the door, my heart pounding. The boy doesn't even know about the inheritance, does he? Diana continued. How convenient that you never mentioned it. All those quarterly payments coming in while he struggled to pay for his mother's treatments. Inheritance? What inheritance? That was different, Dad said. My father left that money in trust. It wasn't mine to give, but it will be mine now. Diana's voice turned sharp. Ours, along with everything else. Unless your ungrateful son starts digging around where he doesn't belong. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Dad had been receiving inheritance money while I sacrificed everything to help with Mom's medical costs. While I gave up my college fund and went into debt, I waited until they left for dinner, then used my key to enter the house. Dad's study was usually locked, but in their haste, they'd left it open. Inside, I found a filing cabinet with documents that made my blood run cold. The inheritance paperwork told the story. Grandfather had left a substantial trust that paid quarterly dividends to his descendants. The payments had been coming for over 20 years, and Dad had been receiving approximately $15,000 every 3 months. While Mom was dying and I was drowning in medical debt, $60,000 a year had been flowing into accounts I never knew existed. But that wasn't the worst discovery. Hidden in another folder were documents about Diana's previous marriage. The newspaper clippings painted a very different picture than the tragic accident story Shed told Dad. Her first husband, William Chen, hadn't died in a car crash. Had committed suicide after discovering Diana's affair and her systematic theft from their joint business accounts. The police report was devastating. William had left a note detailing how Diana had manipulated him, isolated him from friends and family, and slowly gained access to all his financial accounts. By the time he realized what was happening, Shed drained nearly $200,000 from their shared assets. My hands shook as I photographed page after page of evidence. Diana wasn't just a gold digger. She was a predator who targeted vulnerable men and systematically destroyed their lives. More documents revealed her pattern. After William's suicide, Shed moved to Nevada and married a man named Thomas Barrett within 8 months. That marriage lasted 2 years before Thomas discovered money missing from his retirement accounts. Diana had disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving Thomas bankrupt and emotionally devastated. Then Shed found Dad. The timeline was sickeningly clear. Shed researched our family thoroughly before their first chance meeting at the real estate office. She knew about Mom's death, Dad's grief, our financial situation, and most importantly, the inheritance that Dad had never mentioned to anyone. I found contracts and legal documents that made my stomach turn. Diana had already begun the process of gaining control over Dad's assets. Papers granting her power of attorney, insurance policy changes making her the sole beneficiary, and property transfers that would give her ownership of the house if anything happened to Dad. Jake's signature was on several of the documents as a witness and legal advisor. My brother knew, had been helping her. The betrayal cut deeper than Diana's manipulation. Jake had sat there laughing while she humiliated me, knowing he was part of a scheme to steal everything our family had built over generations. I was still taking pictures when I heard a car in the driveway. Quickly, I replaced all the documents exactly as ID found them and slipped out the back door. My mind was racing with implications and possibilities, but one thing was crystal clear. Dad was in danger. Diana's pattern showed escalation. First came the emotional manipulation and financial control, then the isolation from family and friends. The final step, based on what had happened to William Chen, was elimination of the target once Shed secured all their assets. I drove to the one person I knew could help me make sense of what I'd discovered. Sarah Martinez had been Mom's best friend and worked as a private investigator for an insurance company. If anyone could help me verify what I'd found and figure out what to do next, it was Sarah. "Marlon," she said when she opened her door. "What's wrong? You look terrible." I collapsed into her kitchen chair and told her everything. About the wedding humiliation, the inheritance I'd never known existed, and the documents I'd found about Diana's criminal past. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You need to understand something," she finally said. "If what you're telling me is accurate, your father's life is in immediate danger. This woman isn't just a con artist. Based on the pattern you're describing, she's a serial killer who uses marriage as her murder weapon." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of Diana as a thief and manipulator, but Sarah was right. William Chen's suicide wasn't the tragic end of a failed marriage. It was murder by psychological torture. "What do I do?" I asked. "First, we verify everything you found. Then we build a case that will stand up in court and get your father away from her before she escalates to violence." Sarah opened her laptop and began typing. "Give me Diana's full name and everything you know about her background. If she's been running this con across multiple states, there will be records." As I watched Sarah work, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Mom's diagnosis. Hope. For the first time since the wedding, I wasn't completely alone in this fight, but I also felt a crushing weight of responsibility. Dad didn't know he was living with a predator who was planning his death. Jake was either being manipulated or was actively complicit in the scheme, and I was the only one who could save them both. The next few hours would determine whether I could expose Diana's crimes before she moved to the final phase of her plan. The inheritance money she was after wouldn't matter if Dad was dead, but the life insurance policies I'd seen suggested that was exactly what she had in mind. I thought about the grandfather's ring I'd left on the gift table, symbolically severing my connection to a family that had betrayed me. But sitting in Sarah's kitchen, I realized I hadn't walked away from my family at all. I was about to fight for them harder than I'd ever fought for anything in my life. Sarah worked through the night while I paced her living room, too anxious to sleep. By morning, she'd uncovered information that confirmed my worst fears and revealed new horrors I hadn't imagined. "Her real name is Deborah Lynch," Sarah said, showing me printouts from her computer. "She's been using different variations of Diana Richardson for the past 5 years. But before that, she was Deborah Barrett, Deborah Chen, and at least 3 other identities I've found so far." The documentation Sarah had gathered painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal operation. Diana had been running marriage cons across multiple states for over a decade, each time refining her methods and becoming more dangerous. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a police report from California. "Thomas Barrett, her second husband, didn't just lose his money. He ended up hospitalized for what doctors thought was a heart attack. But look at the toxicology report." I scanned the medical documents. Thomas had been found to have unusual levels of digitalis in his system, a plant extract that could mimic heart failure symptoms if administered in small doses over time. "She was poisoning him," I said, the words barely audible. Slowly, carefully, probably in his food or drinks. If he hadn't gotten suspicious and demanded medical tests, he would have died of an apparent heart attack. Diana would have inherited everything as his grieving widow. Sarah pulled up another file. "I found Thomas. Has been living in Nevada, and when I told him about your situation, he agreed to help. Has been trying to track Diana down for 2 years." The phone rang, and Sarah put it on speaker. Thomas Barrett's voice was gravelly, exhausted, but determined. "Son," he said to me, "I'm sorry about what you're going through. This woman destroyed my life, and I've been waiting for a chance to get justice." Thomas told me his story. Head met Diana at his wife's funeral, where Shed appeared as a grief counselor offering support services. Within 6 months, Shed moved into his house and begun isolating him from friends and family. "She had this way of making you feel guilty for caring about anyone else," Thomas explained. "My daughter tried to warn me, but Diana convinced me that my kids were just after my money. She made me change my will, my insurance policies, everything. The pattern was identical to what was happening to Dad. Diana targeted men who were grieving, vulnerable, and financially stable. She studied their lives carefully, then engineered chance meetings that seemed like fate. The scariest part, Thomas continued, is how completely she controlled my thoughts. I started believing things that weren't true, forgetting conversations Wed had, feeling confused and disoriented. It wasn't until after she left that I realized she'd been drugging me. Sarah had more bad news. I contacted your cousin Emma, the family law attorney. She's been trying to reach your father for months about inheritance paperwork, but someone's been intercepting her calls and letters. Emma arrived at Sarah's house that afternoon with a briefcase full of legal documents. Seeing her was like a lifeline back to the family Id thought Id lost. "Marlon," she said, hugging me tightly. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea what was happening." Emma explained that she'd been handling the estate paperwork for my grandfather's trust. The inheritance was far more substantial than Id realized from the documents Id found in Dad's study. "Your grandfather didn't just leave quarterly payments," she said, spreading papers across Sarah's dining table. "There's a family business trust that includes shares in a company that was sold years ago. The accumulated dividends alone are worth over $200,000, but there's also real estate holdings and additional investments. The total inheritance was worth nearly $800,000, money that should have been split between Dad and his heirs but had been hidden from me for years. More importantly," Emma continued, "there's evidence that the trust documents have been tampered with. Someone's been forging your father's signature on papers that would transfer everything to his spouse in the event of his death." Sarah leaned forward. "How long would it take to process those transfers if something happened to Robert? With the forged paperwork already in place, Diana could have access to everything within days of his death." The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Diana wasn't just planning to inherit Dad's existing assets. She was positioning herself to claim a fortune that she'd researched thoroughly before ever meeting him. Thomas' voice came through the speakerphone again. "She's escalating faster than usual. With me, it took 2 years before she started the poisoning. If she's moving this quickly with your father, it means she's getting more confident or more desperate." Emma pulled out her phone. "We need to involve law enforcement, but we'll need more evidence than what we have now. Fortunately, I know exactly how to get it." She explained that we could use the inheritance paperwork to our advantage. Emma would contact Dad directly with urgent legal documents that required his immediate signature, bypassing Diana's control over his communication. If Diana tries to prevent him from meeting with me, or if she insists on being present during legal proceedings, that's evidence of undue influence. If your father shows signs of confusion or memory problems during our meeting, that supports the theory that he's being drugged." Sarah nodded. "And if we can get him away from her long enough for the drugs to clear his system, he might remember things differently." "There's something else," Emma said quietly. "I ran a check on the marriage license. Diana Richardson's legal identity appears to be fraudulent. If she's still married to Thomas under her real name, then her marriage to your father isn't legal." Thomas confirmed it through the phone. "We never got divorced. I couldn't find her to serve papers. Technically, she's committing bigamy on top of everything else." For the first time since the wedding, I felt like we had a real chance. Diana's web of lies was extensive, but that also meant she had more vulnerabilities. Each false identity, each forged document, each lie shed told created opportunities to expose her. But time was running out. If Diana followed her established pattern, Dad's heart attack could happen any day. We needed to act fast, gather irrefutable evidence, and get Dad away from her before she escalated to murder. As I looked around Sarah's dining room table at the documents, the laptop screens, and the faces of people who barely knew me but were willing to fight for justice, I realized something profound. This was what real family looked like. Not the people who shared your blood and then betrayed you, but the ones who stood up for what was right when it mattered most. Diana had tried to isolate me, to make me believe I was alone and worthless. Instead, Shed forced me to discover a strength I never knew I had, and allies I never expected to find. Now we just had to save Dad's life and bring a serial predator to justice before she claimed another victim. Emma arranged to meet Dad at Morrison's Diner, the same place where Head told me about his engagement to Diana 8 months earlier. The neutral location would make it harder for Diana to control the situation, and the public setting would provide witnesses if anything went wrong. I arrived early and sat in a back booth where I could observe without being seen. When Dad walked in, my heart broke. He looked 10 years older than at his wedding just a week ago. His face was gaunt, his movements uncertain, and he kept checking his phone like he was afraid he was in trouble. "Robert," Emma said warmly as she stood to greet him. "Thank you for meeting me. I know it's unusual circumstances, but these inheritance documents are time-sensitive." Dad sat down heavily, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the coffee Emma had ordered for him. "Diana said this could wait until after our honeymoon," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I'm afraid not," Emma replied gently. "There are tax implications that need to be addressed before the end of the month, and some irregularities in the paperwork that require your immediate attention." As Emma spread documents across the table, I watched Dad struggle to focus. He would read a paragraph, then seem to forget what it said. When Emma asked him questions about his father's estate, he gave contradictory answers or looked confused. "Robert, do you remember signing these transfer documents?" Emma asked, showing him papers that would give Diana control over the trust. Dad stared at the signature for a long moment. Yes, I think so. Diana said it was important for our financial planning. But look at the date," Emma pointed out. "This was signed before your engagement was even announced, before you'd introduced Diana to your family." For a moment, Dad's expression cleared, and I saw a flash of the sharp, intelligent man I remembered. "That can't be right," he said. "I wouldn't have. We hadn't even." Then his face went blank again, like a curtain had fallen. "Diana handles our paperwork now. She's much better with financial matters than I am." Emma and I exchanged glances. The cognitive symptoms were obvious even to someone without medical training. Dad was being systematically drugged, probably with something that caused confusion and memory problems, while appearing to be early dementia. That's when Diana and Jake arrived. I watched through the window as they approached the diner entrance together, Diana's face set in cold anger. Shed probably tracked Dad's location through his phone or simply followed him when he left the house. "Robert," Deanna's voice carried across the restaurant as she rushed to his side. "There you are. You had me so worried when you left without telling me where you were going." She slid into the booth next to Dad, effectively placing herself between him and Emma. Jake stood behind them, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Richardson," Emma said formally, "this is a private legal consultation with my client." "Oh, but Robert doesn't handle financial matters alone anymore," Diana replied sweetly. "Do you, honey? The stress has been so hard on him since his son's outburst at our wedding. I think it's affecting his memory." I watched Dad nod automatically, like he'd been trained to agree with whatever Diana said. Emma wasn't intimidated. "Mr. Wilson, I need to ask you some questions about your father's estate that only you can answer. Perhaps we could speak privately." "Anything you need to discuss can be said in front of me," Diana interrupted. "I'm his wife. We have no secrets." That's when Jake's behavior caught my attention. While Diana was focused on dominating the conversation with Emma, Jake was holding his phone under the table, clearly recording everything. When he noticed me watching from across the restaurant, his eyes widened in surprise. Our gazes met, and I saw something in Jake's expression that I hadn't expected: fear. I made a decision. Standing up from my booth, I walked over to their table. "Hello, Dad," I said quietly. Diana's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing pure rage before she recovered her composure. "Marlon," she said through gritted teeth, "how inappropriate of you to interrupt a private meeting." But Dad looked up at me with confusion that seemed genuine rather than drug-induced. "Son, what are you doing here?" "I'm here because I love you, Dad, and because I'm worried about you." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his phone still recording. Diana noticed and grabbed his wrist. "Put that away," she hissed. "No," Jake said, surprising everyone. "I'm keeping it running." Diana's carefully controlled facade cracked completely. "You're all conspiring against me," she snarled. "Robert, tell them to leave us alone." Instead of obeying, Dad looked around the table with growing clarity. Why would everyone be conspiring? Emma's family, Marlon's, my son, Jake's, my son. What would they be conspiring about? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Diana realized Shed made a critical error by letting her true nature show in front of witnesses. Jake set his phone on the table, still recording. "Dad," he said quietly, "how do you feel right now? I mean physically." "Tired," Dad replied, confused. "Like I can't think straight. Diana says it's stress from the wedding." "When did you start feeling this way?" Dad thought for a moment. "After Diana moved in, I think. Maybe a few months ago." Jake looked directly at Diana. "The same time you started making Dad's morning coffee. The special blend you said would help with his energy levels." Diana's composure shattered completely. "You ungrateful little—" "I've been recording our conversations for weeks," Jake interrupted. "All of them. Every threat you made, every lie you told, every time you bragged about how easy it was to control him." The restaurant had gone quiet around us. Other diners were watching our table with undisguised curiosity. "Jake," I said, hardly believing what I was hearing. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" My brother's voice cracked. She had evidence, fake evidence that had been stealing from my law firm's client accounts. She said if I didn't help her, she'd destroy my career and have me arrested. Emma leaned forward. "What kind of evidence?" "Forged documents showing fraudulent transactions, financial records that were completely fabricated but would have been impossible for me to disprove without a lengthy investigation." She said by the time I cleared my name, the scandal would have destroyed my practice. Dad was listening to this exchange with growing horror and clarity. "Diana," he said slowly, "what are they talking about?" "They're lying," Diana said desperately. "Robert, you know I love you. It'd never hurt you." "Then explain why you've been putting something in my coffee," Dad replied, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in months. "Because that's what's been happening, isn't it? You've been drugging me." Diana stood abruptly, knocking over her water glass. "This is ridiculous. I'm leaving." "No," Emma said firmly, pulling out her own phone. "You're not." She dialed 911 while Diana stood frozen, realizing that her carefully constructed plan had completely collapsed. Jake's recordings, Emma's legal documentation, and the testimony of multiple witnesses had trapped her in a web of her own making. As we waited for the police to arrive, Dad reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was weak but steady. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for what I put you through." For the first time in months, his eyes were completely clear. The man I'd grown up loving and respecting was finally coming back to me. But the hardest part was still ahead. We had to prove that Diana had been systematically poisoning him, expose her criminal past, and undo all the legal damage Shed already done to our family. At least now, we were fighting together instead of against each other. 2 days after the confrontation at Morrison's diner, we had everything in place for what Sarah called the controlled burn. Diana had been released after questioning because we didn't yet have direct evidence of poisoning, just suspicious circumstances and Jake's recordings of her threats and manipulation. But we knew she'd escalate now that her cover was blown. Cornered predators become more dangerous, and Diana's pattern showed that when her psychological control failed, she moved quickly to violence. Emma had obtained a court order for toxicology testing on Dad, which confirmed the presence of digitalis and several other substances designed to cause confusion and memory problems. The evidence was building, but we needed to catch Diana in the act to make charges stick. Thomas had flown in from Nevada and was staying at Sarah's house, ready to testify about Deanna's previous crimes. More importantly, Head brought documentation proving that he and Diana were still legally married, making her marriage to Dad invalid and her claim to his assets fraudulent. The plan was simple but dangerous. Dad would return home and act like everything was normal while wearing a wire and surrounded by hidden cameras that Sarah's security company had installed. Diana would try to eliminate the evidence of her crimes by getting rid of the one person who could testify against her. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked Dad as Sarah fitted him with the recording device. "It's going to be dangerous." Dad's hands were steady for the first time in months as the drugs cleared from his system. "She tried to kill me, son. She turned me against my own children and made me complicit in stealing your inheritance. I owe it to you, to Jake, and to her other victims to see this through." Jake was coordinating with the police from his law office, making sure everything we did would be admissible in court. The plan was for Dad to suggest a family dinner as a reconciliation gesture, with Diana believing she'd won and could now safely eliminate her final obstacle. Emma had prepared legal documents that would restore my access to the inheritance and undo all of Diana's fraudulent transfers. Once Diana was arrested, we could begin rebuilding what she'd destroyed. But first, we had to survive the next few hours. Dad returned home that evening carrying takeout from Diana's favorite restaurant and a bottle of wine. I was positioned across the street in Sarah's surveillance van, watching multiple camera feeds from Dad's house and listening to the wire transmission. "Robert." Diana's voice came through clearly as Dad entered the house. "You're back. I was so worried after yesterday's unpleasantness." "I talked to the boys," Dad replied, following the script Wed rehearsed. "You were right about them being jealous and ungrateful. I think I should cut them out of my life completely." "Oh, sweetheart," Diana cooed. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd realize. Family should support each other, not tear each other down." I listened to their conversation over dinner, Diana playing the role of loving wife while subtly reinforcing the narrative that Jake and I were enemies trying to steal Dad's money. What she didn't know was that every word was being recorded in high definition. The moment Wed'd been waiting for came when Dad excused himself to use the bathroom. "Diana," he said, "would you mind making coffee? I feel like I need something to help me think clearly about how to handle the boys." "Of course, darling." Through the hidden cameras, we watched Diana move to the kitchen and begin preparing Dad's coffee. From a small container hidden in her purse, she extracted what looked like a pill, crushed it with a spoon, and mixed the powder into Dad's cup. But this time, she added much more than usual. "She's escalating," Sarah said from beside me in the van. "That's at least 10 times the normal dose." We watched in horror as Diana prepared what was clearly intended to be a fatal dose of whatever cocktail she'd been using to slowly poison Dad. This wasn't about control anymore. She was trying to kill him tonight. Dad returned to the kitchen and reached for the coffee cup. Diana watched him with predatory intensity, probably calculating how long it would take for the massive dose to stop his heart. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her own cup in a toast. Dad lifted the coffee to his lips, then suddenly stopped. You know what? I'm not really in the mood for coffee tonight. This wine is perfect. Diana's face fell. But I made it especially for you. That special blend you love. Maybe later, Dad said casually, pushing the cup away. Diana's mask slipped completely. After months of careful manipulation, her victim was finally refusing to cooperate, and she couldn't hide her frustration. Robert, she said, her voice turning sharp, drink the coffee. You said you needed something to help you think clearly. I changed my mind. Drink it. The command was cold, threatening. Dad looked directly at the hidden camera and smiled. I don't think I will. That's when Diana revealed exactly who she really was. Her carefully constructed persona evaporated, replaced by cold rage and desperate calculation. You know, don't you? She said quietly. Somehow, you figured it out. Figured what out, Diana? That I've been slowly poisoning you for months. That I killed my first husband and was planning to kill you too once I had control of your assets. That everything about our relationship has been a lie designed to steal your money and eliminate your children from the equation. Dad remained calm despite the confession being recorded in perfect clarity. Why would you do something like that? Diana laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. Because men like you are so easy to manipulate. Lonely widowers with money and guilt about their dead wives. You practically beg to be taken advantage of. She moved closer to Dad, and I could see her hand reaching into her purse again. The coffee would have been easier, but there are other ways to trigger a heart attack in someone your age. That was our cue. Sarah radioed the police team that had been waiting outside, and within seconds, Dad's house was surrounded by officers with their weapons drawn. Diana froze as the front door burst open and police flooded into the kitchen. Her hand was still in her purse, clutching what turned out to be a syringe filled with enough digitalis to stop Dad's heart within minutes. Deborah Lynch, the lead detective announced, "You're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, bigamy, and conspiracy." As they handcuffed her, Diana's composure finally broke completely. "You don't understand," she screamed at Dad. "I gave you the best months of your life. You were nothing before me, just a pathetic old man mourning his dead wife." Dad stood up slowly, his voice steady and strong. "You're wrong about that. I was a father. I still am. And my sons just saved my life." Watching Diana being led away in handcuffs was one of the most satisfying moments of my life, but the real satisfaction came from seeing Dad clear-headed and strong again, finally free from the psychological prison shed built around him. The recordings WED captured that night provided everything prosecutors needed for multiple felony convictions. Diana's confession, combined with the physical evidence of the poison and Thomas' testimony about her previous crimes, meant she'd be spending the rest of her life in prison. But more than justice, WED reclaimed our family. Dad was safe, Jake was free from Diana's blackmail, and I was about to discover just how much our grandfather had really left us. The legal proceedings moved quickly once Diana's full criminal history came to light. The FBI had been tracking several unsolved deaths across multiple states that matched her pattern, and our evidence provided the breakthrough they needed to build federal cases for interstate fraud and serial murder. Diana, whose real name was indeed Deborah Lynch, had been running variations of the same con for over 15 years. The evidence suggested she'd successfully killed at least 3 previous husbands and attempted to murder 2 others, including Thomas. The financial damage across all her victims exceeded $2 million. During the 6 weeks it took for Dad to fully recover from the drugs Diana had been giving him, our family began the painful but necessary process of rebuilding trust. Jake and I met regularly with a counselor who specialized in helping families recover from manipulation and abuse. "I need you to understand," Jake told me during one of our sessions. "I wasn't just afraid of her destroying my career. I was terrified that Shed hurt Dad if I didn't cooperate. Everything she asked me to do was framed as protecting him from some threat. The psychology of Diana's manipulation became clearer as we talked through the months leading up to the wedding. Shed isolated Dad from his natural support systems, while convincing him that Jake and I were potential threats to his happiness and security. She showed me fake evidence, Jake continued. Documents that supposedly proved you'd been stealing from Mom's medical fund. Bank statements that looked real but were completely fabricated. She convinced Dad that you were taking advantage of his grief and guilt. Understanding the depth of Diana's deception helped, but the real healing came when Emma presented us with the complete inheritance documentation. My grandfather hadn't just left money, had created a family legacy that Diana had almost destroyed. The family trust was worth $860,000 in total assets, including accumulated dividends, real estate holdings, and shares in a sustainable building supply company that had grown significantly since grandfather's death. The quarterly payments Dad had been receiving represented only a small fraction of the total value. More importantly, the trust included provisions for the family business to be reclaimed by direct descendants if they chose to take active roles in its management. The company, Morrison Family Sustainable Materials, had been operating under distant cousins' management, but was struggling with outdated practices and declining market share. Your grandfather intended this business to provide for multiple generations, Emma explained as we sat in her law office reviewing the documents. He specifically included clauses that would allow his descendants to modernize and expand the operation. I studied the business reports and financial statements. The company had solid fundamentals, but needed fresh leadership and modern marketing approaches. My background in graphic design and digital media could help transform their brand and reach new markets. "What do you think, son?" Dad asked. "It would mean a major life change, but we could do this together." The idea of working alongside Dad to build something meaningful was appealing, but I needed to be sure his judgment was completely clear. "Are you certain this is what you want? Not something you feel obligated to do because of what happened?" Dad smiled, and for the first time in over a year, it reached his eyes. "Marlon, Eve spent the past 3 years making terrible decisions because I was afraid of being alone with my grief. Diana exploited that fear and almost destroyed everything your mother and I built together. I want to spend whatever time I have left building something positive with my sons." Jake had his own decision to make. His law practice had suffered during the months Head been under Diana's control, but Head managed to avoid the professional destruction Shed threatened. Several clients had stood by him once they learned the truth about his situation. "I'm thinking about changing my practice focus," Jake told us. "What we went through, what Dad experienced. It's happening to elderly people all over the country. I want to specialize in elder abuse cases and fraud prevention." The symmetry was perfect. I would work on building the family business while Jake used his legal skills to help other families avoid the trap we'd fallen into. Thomas Barrett flew back for Diana's sentencing hearing. Seeing her in prison orange, instead of expensive designer clothes, was a stark reminder of how completely the tables had turned. She showed no remorse during her statement, blaming her victims for being weak and gullible. "The defendant has shown a complete lack of empathy for her victims," the judge said before imposing sentence. The psychological torture inflicted on these families, combined with the financial devastation and loss of life, represents some of the most callous criminal behavior this court has ever encountered. Diana received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. She would never have the opportunity to target another family. But the real closure came 3 months later, when Dad and I stood in the offices of Morrison Family Sustainable Materials, looking at business plans and renovation proposals. The company's employees, most of whom had worked there for decades, were excited about the prospect of family leadership returning. "Your grandfather would be proud," said Margaret Foster, the office manager who'd known our family for 30 years. He always hoped one of his descendants would come back to carry on what he started. Dad had insisted on a formal ceremony to restore my place in the family inheritance. In front of Emma, Jake, and several family friends, he placed grandfather's ring back on my finger and presented me with documents transferring my rightful share of the trust assets. "This should have happened years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I let grief and guilt cloud my judgment, and I almost lost you forever. I promised to spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much you mean to me." The money was life-changing, but the restoration of our family relationship was priceless. For the first time since Mom's death, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. Jake surprised us both by announcing that Head used his share of the inheritance to establish a legal aid foundation focusing on elder abuse cases, the Marlon Wilson Foundation for Family Protection, he said with a grin. "Since you're the one who saved us all." I protested the name, but Dad and Emma overruled me. "Your courage to fight back when you had nothing left to lose." Dad said, "That's what exposed Diana's crimes and saved not just our family, but all her future victims." As we worked together over the following months to modernize the family business, I realized that Diana's greatest failure wasn't underestimating my determination or overlooking the evidence that would convict her. Her greatest failure was believing that destroying a family's trust would make them weaker. Instead, surviving her manipulation had made us stronger than we'd ever been before. We'd learned to communicate honestly, to question assumptions, and to value our relationships above material wealth. The quarterly inheritance payments that Dad had hidden for years were now being invested back into the family business and Jake's foundation. The money was finally being used the way Grandfather had intended, to build something lasting that would benefit multiple generations. 6 months after Diana's arrest, Morrison Family Sustainable Materials had doubled its client base and expanded into 3 new markets. Jake's foundation had helped 12 families recover assets from various fraud schemes and prevented at least 4 additional marriage cons from succeeding. But the most meaningful change was simpler than business success or legal victories. Dad and I had dinner together every Tuesday evening, and Jake joined us whenever his schedule allowed. We talked about everything: business plans, Mom's memory, our hopes for the future, and our gratitude for surviving Diana's attempt to destroy us. Those dinners reminded me that family isn't just about shared genetics or legal obligations. It's about choosing to fight for each other, even when that fight seems hopeless. Diana had tried to convince me that I was worthless and alone, but the truth was exactly the opposite. I was valuable precisely because I was willing to stand up for what was right, and I was never alone because real love doesn't disappear when tested by adversity. 1 year after Diana's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of Morrison Family Sustainable Materials, looking out at our expanded team of employees and reflecting on how completely our lives had changed. The business had grown beyond my wildest expectations. But more importantly, our family had healed in ways I'd never thought possible. Dad walked into the room carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen since before Mom got sick. "The Portland contract came through," he announced. 50,000 square feet of sustainable flooring for their new civic center. Our employees cheered. The Portland project was our largest contract to date and would establish Morrison Family Sustainable Materials as a major player in the Pacific Northwest market. But the real celebration was for what the success represented: a family legacy that Diana had tried to destroy but had ultimately made stronger. "I have something for you," Dad said, pulling a small jewelry box from his pocket. "I found this in your mother's things last week." Inside was Mom's wedding ring, the simple gold band shed worn for 32 years of marriage. He had wondered what happened to it after her death, but Dad had been too grief-stricken to talk about her personal belongings. "She wanted you to have this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for yourself, but for when you find someone worthy of the love she taught you to give." I slipped the ring onto a chain around my neck, where it rested next to my heart alongside the grandfather's ring I now wore on my finger. The weight of both rings felt like a promise and a responsibility to honor the family legacy by building something worthy of the sacrifice previous generations had made. Jake arrived for our weekly family dinner with news of his own. The Wilson Foundation just received approval for federal funding, he announced. We're expanding to cover 10 states and hiring 5 new attorneys, specifically to handle marriage fraud cases. In the year since Diana's arrest, Jake's foundation had helped recover over $3 million for fraud victims and had assisted law enforcement in preventing dozens of similar crimes. The work had given him a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal success. There's something else, Jake continued. I've been working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and they want to create a national database of marriage fraud patterns based on Diana's case. They're asking us to consult on the project. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Diana's crimes had been so systematic and well documented that her methods were now being used to train law enforcement officers and protect other families from similar predators. Thomas Barrett had become a regular visitor, staying with us whenever his work brought him to the East Coast. His testimony had been crucial in convicting Diana, but more than that, had become part of our extended family, bonded by shared survival and determination to prevent others from experiencing what we'd been through. I got a letter from California yesterday, Thomas told us over dinner. The prosecution in Diana's first husband's case is finally moving forward. They're charging her with murder in William Chen's death based on evidence they found in her storage unit. Diana's conviction for attempted murder in Dad's case had been just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper into her background, they'd uncovered evidence linking her to multiple suspicious deaths across 15 years. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, never again able to target vulnerable families. But the most meaningful development wasn't about Diana at all. It was about the relationships we'd rebuilt and the new ones we'd formed. Sarah Martinez had become like a second mother to me, offering guidance and support as I navigated the challenges of running a family business. Emma had helped Dad establish a college scholarship fund in Mom's memory for students whose families had faced medical financial hardship, using part of the inheritance to ensure the scholarship would continue in perpetuity. Most importantly, Dad and I had learned to communicate with the honesty and trust that Diana had tried to destroy. We talked through our decisions, shared our fears and hopes, and supported each other through the challenges of building something meaningful together. You know, Dad said as we cleaned up after dinner, your mother would be so proud of the man you've become, not because of the business success or the money, but because you had the courage to fight for family when it would have been easier to walk away. The wedding humiliation that had seemed like the worst moment of my life had actually been the beginning of discovering my true strength. When Diana forced me to choose between accepting abuse and standing up for my dignity, I'd chosen to fight. That choice had saved not just my own life, but Dad's life and the lives of her future victims. Standing up to her hadn't been about anger or revenge. It had been about love. Love for the father who raised me, love for the family legacy that was bigger than any individual, and love for the values Mom had taught me about treating people with dignity and respect. As I locked up the office that evening and headed home to my own house, purchased with inheritance money that was finally mine by right, I thought about the grandfather's ring on my finger and the promise it represented. Each generation of our family had faced challenges and made sacrifices to build something lasting for their children. Diana had seen our family's wealth and history as something to steal and destroy, but she had misunderstood the most important truth about family legacies. They're not just about money or property. They're about values, relationships, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. The business was thriving, the foundation was saving lives, and Dad was healthier and happier than had been since Mom's death. But the real victory was simpler than any of those achievements. We were a family again, bound not by obligation or guilt, but by choice and love and mutual respect. Diana had tried to convince me that I was worthless, that I didn't deserve a place at my own father's table. Instead, Shed forced me to discover that I was strong enough to build my own table and generous enough to make sure everyone who belonged there had a seat. The lesson that emerged from our ordeal wasn't about forgiveness or turning the other cheek. Sometimes love requires you to fight, to refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth, and to stand up for principles that matter more than temporary peace. I'd learned that real family isn't about people who share your genetics. It's about people who stand with you when you're fighting for what's right, who celebrate your successes without jealousy, and who love you enough to tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable. As I pulled into my driveway and looked at the house I'd been able to buy with money that was rightfully mine, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the material security, but for the journey that had led me here. The pain, the betrayal, and the fear had all been real, but they'd also been necessary steps in discovering who I really was and what I was capable of achieving. Diana would spend the rest of her life in prison, paying for the damage Shed inflicted on multiple families. But her greatest punishment wasn't the legal consequences. It was knowing that Shed failed in her ultimate goal of destroying our family bonds. Instead of breaking us apart, Shed forged us into something stronger than we'd ever been before. Have you ever had to stand up for your family when everyone else had given up hope? Sometimes the people we love most need us to fight for them, even when they can't fight for themselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts about family loyalty and the courage it takes to do what's right in difficult situations. Please share your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming adversity and fighting for family. Don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that they're stronger than they realize and that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's sometimes the most loving thing you can do. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you always have more strength than you think, and real family will always be worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the situation seems.